and that's my son. All right, we are in week 3 of our command by command journey through the 10 Commandments, and we are taking a long look at these commands in order to better understand who God is and how he's at work in the world, and how me and you, as those who bear God's image, and as we'll talk about today, those who bear God's name, how we are supposed to live in light of those realities. And we're in, as we've talked about, we're in this section of the 10 Commandments, the first 4 of them, and they all kind of talk about different ways that we minimize who God is, right? How they different tendencies of humanity to minimize and reduce the God of the Exodus. And they each confront us with a different question, right? So the first commandment, it confronted us with the question, are we trivializing God's place in our life? The second commandment confronts us with the question, are we trying to domesticate God? Are we trying to tame the God of the Exodus into a calf that is dependent upon its mother for milk? Today we're going to focus on this question. Are we using God for our own purposes, right? So do we take God's name, his power, his character, his essence, and do we slap it onto our agendas? And then next week, we will begin a 2-week part series in which we're confronted with this question. Are me and you, are we attempting to be God ourselves? Are we attempting to be the sun that keeps everything else in life in orbit? Today, though, as I said, we're confronted with that third question. The question is this, right? Are we using God's name for our own advancement? Are we using God's name to advance our agendas in this world? And it comes from the third commandment, which reads like this. God says, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord your God will not hold anyone guiltless who uses his name. The way we often shorthand version of this command is, don't take the Lord's name in vain. All right, think about that word vanity. It's about yourself, okay? So don't use the Lord's name to promote yourself, all right? Now, there's 2 things that we really need to address here before we can kind of get at the heart of this commandment. The first is this. This commandment, as much as you may have heard as a child, it is not about cussing, okay? I don't know how this commandment about not taking the Lord's name in vain, how it was reduced to not saying 10 to 20 words in the English language, okay? I don't know. Now, I stand before you, and I'm not endorsing cussing, okay? I'm not, if you have kids in the room, I'm not endorsing cussing for your kids in the moment. However, I am saying this. We cannot merely clean up our language, check off this box of this commandment, and move on with our life as if we're obeying it, okay? It is more than that, all right? Now, the second thing that we need to address here is this, before we can really jump into this commandment, is this. One's name is tied to one's essence, okay? So someone's name is actually tied, in a sense, to their being. Shakespeare famously said this, what is in a name? A rose by another name would smell as sweet, all right? The point that he's making is this. A name, we tend to live by this kind of idea. A name is nothing more or less than a sound that we make to get the attention of someone else, okay? So I say, Mary Beth says Ben, all right? All my name means is like, oh, I'm supposed to turn my head and pay attention to her, right? Now, that is kind of how we live in our modern world, right? We may pick a name for our kid because it has a special meaning, but really a name, in a cultural sense, doesn't mean that much. In the ancient Near Eastern world, okay, it's a fancy way of saying, in the world of the Bible, all right, your name revealed something about your character. It was revealing about your essence, okay? So it was an outward sign of an inward truth about who you are. We see this very clearly in Old Testament renamings. We see this particularly in the patriarchs. When I say the patriarchs, it's actually Moses' ancestors, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Okay, so let's think about Abraham. Does anyone know what Abraham's original name was? Abram, which means exalted father. Abraham, his name is changed to Abraham when God says, you will be a father of many nations. Okay, do you know what Abraham might mean? Exalted father of many nations. So his name reveals something about who he is, right? Jacob. Does anyone know what Jacob means? Supplanter. It could mean heel. It means to follow in a sense. So Jacob comes after Esau, who's the firstborn, right? And he says, grabs onto his heel, right? Okay, and Jacob's name reveals something about who he is. What is his name changed to? Jacob becomes, okay, which means one who wrestles with God. Well, that happens after he literally wrestles with God, okay? So yet again, I'm just trying to begin to introduce this concept that one's name reveals something about somebody's essence, okay? And this, when we understand this idea that in the Bible and the world that surrounds it, that one's name actually means something, we then begin to understand the importance of the passage that Wayne and Cam just read over us. Because in all of Scripture, it is the first time that God reveals to us his name. In other words, it's not just that God is telling us, hey, here's what you say to me to get my attention. It is God saying, this is who I am. This is God revealing his inner essence. It is God revealing his character to his people. All right? So the story, it's a very famous story, the story of the burning, as you see behind me, right? It's the story of the burning bush. And in this conversation Moses and God are having, God is telling Moses that it is now his responsibility to go before his former brother, Ramesses, Pharaoh, and to say, let my people go. And understandably, Moses has a few questions for God, all right? And so Moses has this line of questioning for God. And then the final question he asks is this. Okay, well, if the Israelites ask me, who is sending me? Who is telling me, right? Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? All right? Now, this is not a random question, right? This isn't like, well, hey, what are we supposed to call this guy? It isn't that, right? This is a question about what? It is a question about God's character. That's what they're asking. Moses is predicting, hey, this God is, Israelites are going to say, this God wants to save us, but who is this God? What is he like? Is he a God by whom we are interested in being saved? Do you get why Moses would predict this question? What is his name is also asking, what is he like? Who is this God? And God responds to him with these very famous words that we now write out as YHYH, that we pronounce either Jehovah or Yahweh, right? The fancy, this is just because I'm a nerd here. If I had glasses, I'd shove them up my nose. The fancy way of saying this is it's called the Tetragrammaton, okay? Say Tetragrammaton with me. 1, 2, 3. Tetragrammaton. That was just for fun, guys. I'm just trying to get you engaged here. Right? It's called the Tetragrammaton, but it goes like this. I am who I am. In other words, what God is saying to Moses, my name, what I'm like, my character cannot be compared to anything else in all of creation, for I am the creator of all things. No, I can't be compared to anything else. I am simply who I am. When they say what God wants to save us out of Egypt, you tell them, I am the unmoved mover. I'm the ultimate reality that pre-exists everything else. I'm the one who created all things, including you. I am who I am. For nothing begot me, but I begat everything else. I exist outside of your plans and your actions. I don't depend on you. You depend on me. I am who I am. You are who you are only in relation to me. You don't exist outside of my presence, whether you realize it or not. I pre-exist your thoughts and your feelings. I pre-exist your plans. I pre-exist your actions. You don't set the agenda. I set the agenda. So think about the context of this story. What God is saying, when the Israelites say, who is this God that wants to save us up out of Egypt? You tell them, I am who I am. What he's saying to them is this whole Exodus idea, this is not your plan that you're inviting me, the God, into. This is my plan that you're being invited into. I'm the main character of this story, not you. That's what God's name reveals about who he is. I'm inviting you into my plans, not the other way around. That's God's name. And so this morning, as we think about the third commandment, right? Don't take the Lord's name in. The question we have before us is this. What does it mean for us to take that specific name in vain? What does it mean to misuse the name I am who I am? The third commandment, in many ways, is a direct rebuttal of a specific ancient Near Eastern practice. So before the great invention of the pinky promise, right? Before that wonderful invention, the question stands, how did you know? You know, like, how do I know you're going to hold up your end of the bargain? How do I know that you're going to, if we agree on something, how do I know that you're actually going to follow through, right? How do I know you're trustworthy? Okay? And one of the ancient Near Eastern practices to kind of, to shore up an agreement was to swear by someone else's name, right? It's how I'm going to assure you so-and-so is going to back me up on this. I'll agree to this because so-and-so, they're going to back me up on it, right? This practice, in a sense, is what is called an appeal to authority, right? And hopefully that makes sense to you. It's an appeal to authority, to back up a promise or to end up in a dispute, right? This thing that I'm agreeing to, this claim that I'm making, this idea that I'm proposing to you, so-and-so is going to back me up on it, right? And so it's this appeal to authority. And if it's an appeal to authority, think about it, right? You're not going to appeal to a peer, right? You're not going to appeal to your brother. You're not going to appeal to just Joe Schmo friend or that rando down the street. You're going to appeal to what? A higher authority. Your word's not enough, so it takes someone greater than you to appeal to. And so you're going to often swear by either a ruler or a deity, often gods who are both Lord and God. We're going here. So you're not appealing to a peer, but you're appealing to this higher authority. I want you to think about it for a second, okay? I want you to think about this ancient Near Eastern practice. That is what God is prohibiting here in the third commandment. Now you're allowed to talk as I ask this question. What problem is God foreseeing? Think about this practice, and he's prohibiting it here. And think about what his name is and what it reveals about his character. What problem is God foreseeing? Why would God not allow people to misuse his name and use it as an appeal to authority? Someone's got to say something loud. False prophecy. So you're saying that I said this, but I never said this. Yeah. What else? The cheapening of who he is, says the man with the notes. Some of you. That was a really thoughtful response. I mean, that guy should get his PhD in Old Testament just for knowing that off the cuff. Think about it, though, right? False prophecy, the cheapening of God's name. I've joked in my head so many times of how I'd introduce this concept. So, are you familiar with inflation? I know, I'm hilarious. Of course you're familiar with inflation, right? You bought eggs, you're familiar with inflation. All right, but think about inflation, right? Think about what inflation really is. It is the cheapening of currency because it has been printed and spent frivolously. And that is a difficult word to say, right? It is the cheapening of money's value because it has been printed and used frivolously. The most extreme example of this probably comes, not now. I know you may think it's now, but it's not now. It probably comes in post-war World War I Germany, right? So after World War I, Germany is saddled with all, and I mean like all of the war debt, okay? And so what does the German government do, right? They print tons and tons and tons of money in order to pay off their war debt. All right, and they do this so much that by the I think it's by what's the date here? It's by 1923. 42 billion German marks was equivalent to 1 American cent. The cheapening of money, right? Because it's just been spent and used and printed frivolously, right? By the way, if you look up German inflation, it'll come up with photos. The kids would use like these big blocks of German marks that have been like put together with rubber bands as blocks and toys, and they build little forts out of them. Often people use the money as wallpaper, and it was much, think about a German winter. Think about you're in the Bavarian Alps. Are you going to spend this money that's worth nothing, or are you going to use it as kindling for a fire? The cheapening of something. into mere toys and decoration, something that meant just, not what it was made for. In the third commandment, what God is saying is this: don't do that. Don't use my name so frivolously that it means nothing to you and it means nothing to the world around you. Don't slap my name onto your plans and your agendas and your purposes, because that'll cheapen my name to the world and to you. And if you do that enough, guess what? You'll start breaking the second commandment. You'll start misunderstanding who I really am. You will have tamed me into something I am not, for I am who I am. I'm creator, and everything else is creature. Don't slap my name onto your plans. Don't leverage my character for your agendas. Don't diminish my essence by tying it to your vision of life. You see, God's name is not something we smack onto our whims in order to justify them. God's name is not a political football we throw around to give weight to an argument. God's name is not a decoration to pretty up a position. It is not a toy merely to be played with. It is the thing around which the rest of our life should be oriented, for he is who he is. He is the one who pre-exists all things, the ultimate reality that pre-exists everything else, the one that created all things, including me and including you. He is the unmoved mover. That's not a name that's meant to be used. That is a name that simply only one thing can be done with. That is a name that can only be worshiped. Right? Now, I don't think there's a better example of the breaking of the third commandment than Mark chapter 8. And I want to share with you the story it'll take up the rest of the morning. I'll share with you the story in Mark chapter 8. And my hope and the intent of this sharing the story is that it will serve as a mirror for me and you, and that we might see ourselves in this story, and we might come to better understand how me and you are tempted to break this third commandment of using the Lord's name in vain. So think about the Gospel of Mark for a second. Let me set up this story for you. The Gospel of Mark is broken down into two sections, all right? The writer himself is clearly telling two different stories in one story. The first story comes in Mark chapters 1 through 8, in which Mark is really introducing who Jesus is, all right? And the goal is trying to get you to wrap your heads around, okay, Jesus really is this Jewish Messiah, okay? And it unpacks the first 2.5 years of Jesus' ministry. And then we have chapters 9 through 16, the second half of the book of Mark. And in this story, Mark is really covering Jesus' journey to Jerusalem so that he might be journeying to the cross, all right? And Mark 8 serves as the pivotal moment in this story. This is what we're going to immerse ourselves in for the rest of the day. It's kind of the hinge of the story of when Jesus turns from just doing his ministry and kind of introducing everyone to who he is to finally living into his divinely intended purpose as the Messiah, the anointed one of God. And so as he's beginning to make this journey, so I want you to think for a second that you're one of the 12 disciples, okay? You've been following Jesus for 2.5 years at this point, and you've watched him teach. You've watched him heal. You've watched him cast out demons. You're like, man, this is awesome. Okay, it has been a great 2.5 years for you. You're like, I've hitched my wagon to the right horse. Okay, this has been amazing for you, but it wasn't always going to be that way. And Jesus knows that. He foresees that. And so he wants to prepare you for what's going to come. He wants to prepare you for what's heading next in your life. And so he takes his 12 disciples, he takes you and all the others to a place called Caesarea Philippi. And this is a place where it's a major center of worship for the Greek god Pan, which is the god of nature, and Caesarea, that is a reference to Caesar, okay? It is a place of imperial worship. In other words, he's taking you to this place of contested gods. And it's a place that really begs the question, who's in charge of the world? Who's in charge of your life? That's literally the physical context of the story. And he takes his 12 disciples, including you, up to this mountain, and he asks a very value-neutral, safe question. He says, who do people say that I am? It's a value-neutral. It's not who you say. Who do people say that I am? There's right answers to this, and you know them. Well, they say you're John the Baptist. Others say you're Elijah. Some say you're, one of the prophets. And by the way, if you're a disciple and he's any of those guys, you're okay with it, right? Man, this is going very well for you if he's any of those people. And then Jesus, okay, he's kind of softening you up with the softball question, and then let's ratchet it up. And he says, okay, that's what people say that I am, but who do you say that I am? And Peter is willing, let's give Peter credit for a moment. Peter is willing to be bold enough to say, you are the Messiah. And I want you to imagine now that you're not just one of the 12 disciples. Imagine you're Peter. You can get into his head a little bit. He says that. Jesus kind of gives him that affirmative nod, that wink, that little twinkle in his eye that says, you're right. And on the outside, Peter's playing like it's cool. You know, I've been here before. Yeah, man. Just one of the Messiah's disciples. But on the inside, you have to think Peter is jumping like a little schoolboy. In his mind, these ideas begin racing. I mean, you can just see the wheels of Peter's mind begin to churn. This guy I've been following is the anointed one of God. He is the Messiah. He is the one that God promised that he would send his people. He is going to come in to Jerusalem. He's going to mobilize the Jews. He's going to overthrow the Roman Empire, and he's going to restore Israel to its former glory. I've hitched my wagon to the right horse. The wheels in Peter's mind are just churning with joy. And while all this is going on in his head, Jesus says the exact opposite is true. He goes on to say that as the Messiah, he must be rejected by the very Jewish leaders you think I'm going to mobilize. They're going to reject me. I'm going to be killed at their hands, and then on the third day, I'm going to be raised from the dead. Now, this is another moment in which you get to talk. So these simultaneous things are happening. All those things are going through Peter's mind. And then at the same time, Jesus is saying the exact opposite is true. Everything you thought about the Messiah is wrong. Everything you thought about God's character, everything you had assigned to God's character, not how he's going to do this. You're Peter, what's going through your mind? You can talk. What's going through your mind if you're Peter? Say it, you're just going to have to speak up. It's not going to happen. No, there's a sense of disbelief that Jesus must be wrong. Okay, what else? What are you feeling if you're Peter? You're very confused. I mean, at minimum, you're very confused. This is not what I signed up for, right? What else? Fear. Yes, there's immense fear. No. I'm following you, so if you die, that means I die. I thought we were going to kill the Romans. You're Peter. What do you feel? Yes, you are so angry. No, Jesus. You're angry, right? I mean, I think at best, if you're Peter on a good day, you might just be merely confused. But if you're Peter on a bad day, imagine he's already had a long day. He said, walk up a mountain. He's probably had a long day. He's probably hungry. He's hangry at this point. He is so angry with Jesus. I mean, think about it, right? I mean, while all this is going on in his head, Jesus says, no, the exact opposite is true. And we read in the text, it says that Peter rebukes Jesus. He says, you're the Messiah, but guess what? I'm going to rebuke you. You're not going to tell me what the Messiah is. I'm going to tell you what the Messiah is. Everything that was running through his head spills out of his mouth. No, you're not going to die at the hands of the Jewish leaders. You're going to go and you're going to mobilize them. And we're going to overthrow the Romans. I mean, have you watched yourself lately, Jesus? You can gather a crowd. You can feed an army. We've already, in the Gospel of Mark, we've already gone through the feeding of the 5,000, okay? You can gather an army. You can feed them by yourself. You can heal the wounded. I mean, Jesus, you were made for this. You're the perfect military leader. Someone gets stabbed, you just go, boom, and they're better. We're invincible. And in so doing, Peter, in rebuking Jesus, is breaking the third commandment. He has his own plans. He has his own purposes. He has his own agendas. And yet he has smacked the name of God's anointed one onto them. He is telling the one who set the world into motion, the one who exists outside of our plans and our actions, the one who pre-exists our thoughts and our feelings, my terms, my agendas, my plans, your name. You've endorsed what I have planned out for this life and this world. And I want you just to think for a second about the cost of if Jesus doesn't rebuke Peter. All right, so in the text it says, but when Jesus turned and looked at the disciples, he rebuked Peter. But I want you to think for a second, what would have happened if Jesus didn't rebuke his breaking of the third commandment? What's at stake here? The name of Yahweh, I am who I am, would have been cheapened. Jesus' arrest, his trial, his suffering, his crucifixion, his resurrection, his ascension upon high at the right hand of the throne of God, which has secured for God's people an everlasting kingdom without an end, would have been traded for finite, fickle, fleeting, temporary, human power. That's the stakes of the third commandment. That's the stakes if we break this law that God has given us. If we say, my plans, your name, we're trading an everlasting kingdom with no end to something that will merely in time fall. And before we cast a stone at Peter, which, by the way, very tempted to do at this moment, right? How often do me and you fall into that exact same trap? How often do me and you find ourselves wielding God's name for our plans and our purposes and to advance our power in this world and therefore cheapen it to both ourselves and the world around us? Think about social media, right? Social media, in my opinion, has made the breaking of the third commandment the easiest thing in the world. All right, how many times have you seen on social media a post that says something like this? Only real Christians will share this. Ugh! As if Christians don't have better things to do with their day than share things on social media? Have we slapped God's name onto our purposes? How often on social media do you see that article or that video that claims that you can only be a Christian if you hold socio-political view X, Y, or Z? Slapping God's name onto our socio-political agendas. By the way, I see this every day on both the cultural right, but also the cultural left. The cultural left still will wield God's name for their purposes. Don't worry, I'll give you a couple examples in a second. How often have you seen this? A political leader referencing the Bible or Jesus or God in order to justify a certain action or view. Our current president has said these words: God saved me to make America great again. God's name, my agenda. Now, I'm not critiquing the agenda right now. I'm not critiquing the agenda. I'm critiquing the breaking of the third commandment. God saved me so that I can do what I said I wanted to do. God's name, my human agenda. By the way, I said I would give you examples on the cultural left. Don't worry, Kamala Harris did basically the same thing. She said this. Let me look it up. I have it here on a text that I sent myself so I could read it to you now. She said this at a church in Philadelphia. In just 9 days, this is 9 days before the election, we have the power to decide the fate of our nation for generations to come. And on this day, on this beautiful Sunday morning, I am reminded God expects us to help Him. I don't care what side of the political aisle you find yourself on. Your politicians you voted for broke the third commandment. And as Christians, we shouldn't be okay with it. And we should call our politicians to the floor and to task for breaking this commandment. Call the politician you voted for, send them an email and say, that's not okay. If you voted in this last election for either of the candidates of the two main parties, say something about it. And by the way, don't say about the party that you didn't vote for. No. You don't have any stake in that game. Say it about the party that you did vote for. Because either way, your candidate broke the third commandment. And it's not okay. We cannot slap God's name onto our political agenda. By the way, Joe Biden did this as well. Remember when he said in his interview about his cognitive abilities, he said it would take what? The Lord Almighty to come down and tell me not to run. By the way, think about what that implies, that the Lord Almighty wants him to run. God's name, my agenda. Cultural left. Our current president has said the words, right? Let me just remind you of what he said. God saved me to make America great again. God's name, my agenda. How often are we just like Peter? It's not okay for either side of the party to do this, either side of the aisle to do this. Now, it is very easy for me to stand up here and bash politicians. I mean, that's literally literally, can you think of a more easy job for a preacher to do than get up and bash politicians? So let's make it a little bit more personal. Sure, our politicians break the third commandment. Certainly, hopefully by this point you agree with me, they do. But how often do me and you, how often do we come up with a plan for our life and then ask God to bless it, rather than seek for God's will for our life and then follow it? You see, does God only shape and form how you go about what you've already decided to do, or does God set the agenda for what you do with your life in the first place? Are you inviting God into your plans, or are you asking God what his plans are and joining in? Is the Exodus his idea or ours in the story that we tell ourselves? How often do we find ourselves, think about this one, really, rejecting Christ's way, but still claiming his name as a Christian, one who follows Christ? We think about some of the commands of Christ here. His call to deny ourselves all the way to the cross. His call to forgive those who have harmed us. His call to pray for those who persecute us. His call for us to wield our power on behalf of others rather than ourselves. His call for us to seek out the marginalized rather than higher status. His call for us to withhold judgment, for vengeance is the Lord's. How his call to share his gospel with people who act and think and feel and talk like us, as well as those who don't act and think and feel and talk like us. Making disciples of what? All nations. Even the ones that we say we don't like. His call to mutually submit inside the church in a covenant. His call to mutually submit inside of our marriages. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. His call to sell all that we have and give it to the poor. His call to reconcile with others even when they're angry at us, and also even when we're angry at them. His call for us to repent, for the kingdom of heaven has drawn near. A kingdom that is without no end. A king whose king is I am. The thing that should set the agenda for the rest of our lives. How often do we reject Christ's call but still bear his name as Christians? Right? The term for this is nominal Christianity. Christian in name only. See, anytime we are a Christian in name only, we're breaking the third commandment. As one preacher said of this command, he said, the problem is not a decreasing number of Christians in our pew, but rather that the Christians in our pew aren't Christian enough. We wield Christ's name, but not his way, and in so doing, cheapen who he is to both ourselves and the world around us. Now, I've gone on far too long, and so let me close out with this thought, because this is severe, right? The next thing to come, and Elijah, I'm sorry, I'm just butchering everything that's left on what you have for your slides. But the call next is, what does he say? Hey, by the way, if you want to follow me, I mean, Peter, you may think that you know what's going on, but if you want to follow me, you better deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow me. That's the only, because that's where I'm heading, is the cross. All right? And we break that command probably each and every day, in which we bear Christ's name, but not his way. And that is an if you're like me and you just actually sit and you wrestle with that fact, that is an overwhelming sense of guilt and shame, right? But I want you to think, as we close, I want you to think about Peter's story just for a second. Peter is going to break the third commandment, not just in Mark chapter 8, but again and again and again and again. From Mark 8 on, he's going to cut off the ear of the soldier when they come to arrest Jesus. My plans, your name. He's going to reject Christ at his trial. I don't know that man. He's going to, even after Christ is resurrected and is ascended to the right hand of the throne of God, he's going to refuse to eat with Gentiles because he's afraid of what his Jewish brothers might say about him. But think about Peter's story. Christ never, and I mean never, stopped pursuing and using Peter to further his great plans and purposes for his people and his world. And the same is true of me and you. No matter how often me and you, we break the third commandment, Christ is never, his agenda is never thwarted, and he's never stopped, even though you have attempted, you and I, even though we've attempted to thwart it. He has never stopped pursuing us and using us to further his plans and purposes. What they intended for evil, God intended for good. And that is good, wonderful, perfect news. If you